James Holden guided his yellow cab through the snowy streets of Meadowview, the heater humming faintly as flakes danced against the windshield. The city was quieter tonight, the bitter cold chasing most people indoors. For James, nights like these were a double-edged sword. Fewer passengers meant fewer fares, but the rare stillness gave him time to reflect on his own life, its struggles, its moments of fleeting joy, and the weight of simply getting by. James adjusted the heater, trying to keep warm as his cab rumbled along the nearly empty streets. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, coated in fresh snow, when something caught his attention. A man sat slumped on a bench under the dim light of a flickering lamppost. His shoulders were hunched, his thin coat barely enough to shield him from the wind, and his head hung low as though the cold had seeped into his very bones. James slowed his cab to a crawl, debating whether he should stop. The man wasn't flagging him down or looking up, but something about the scene tugged at James's conscience. Finally, he pulled over and rolled down his window. "Hey buddy," James called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "You all right over there?" The man lifted his head slowly, startled by the voice cutting through the silence. His face was pale, his beard scraggly and unkempt. Deep brown eyes, rimmed with fatigue and something heavier shame, perhaps met James's gaze. "I'm fine," he replied hoarsely, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Just waiting for the train." James frowned, glancing at the darkened station a block away. Its locked doors and empty platforms confirmed what he already knew. "No trains this late," James said gently. "They stopped running hours ago." The man hesitated, his gaze shifting downward. "Yeah, I know," he admitted softly, the weight of the confession sinking into the space between them. James turned off the meter and stepped out of the cab. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his jacket and scarf, but he ignored it as he approached the man. Up close, James could see the red splotches on his cheeks and the way his hands trembled against his knees. The man's shoes were soaked through, the thin fabric offering no protection against the icy slush beneath them. "What's your name?" James asked, crouching slightly to meet the man's eye. "Ben," he replied after a pause. "Ben Marshall." "Well, Ben, it's freezing out here. Do you have anywhere to go tonight?" Ben shook his head, the motion almost imperceptible. "No, but I'll figure something out," he murmured. James studied him for a moment, his heart aching at the sight of the man's quiet desperation. There was a tension in Ben's posture, a guarded defiance, as if he expected pity or rejection, and was steeling himself against both. "Listen," James said, his voice steady and warm. "You'll freeze if you stay out here much longer. Let me help you out tonight." Ben's face tightened. "I'm not looking for a handout," he said, his tone firm but tired. "I get that," James said, nodding. "But this isn't about charity. It's about making sure you're safe. Tomorrow, you can figure out your next steps, but tonight, you need a warm place to sleep." Ben hesitated, his eyes searching James's face for any trace of pity or judgment. Instead, he found quiet sincerity. Slowly, his shoulders sagged, and he let out a shaky breath. "I don't want to be a burden," he muttered. "You're not," James assured him. "Come on, it's too cold to argue." Ben let out a small, bitter chuckle and nodded reluctantly. James opened the cab door and helped him inside, turning the heat up as they pulled away from the curb. "I know a place," James said. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." The ride was mostly silent at first, save for the hum of the heater and the occasional sniffle from Ben. James didn't push him to talk, sensing that the man needed time to process. Instead, James stole glances at Ben in the rearview mirror, his hollow cheeks and weary eyes hinting at a life that had been anything but kind. As they neared the budget hotel James had in mind, he finally broke the silence. "If you don't mind me asking," James began carefully, "how'd you end up out here?" Ben didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered streets outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I had a good job once," he said. "Worked in construction. Steady paycheck, decent benefits. I wasn't rich, but I was doing okay. James nodded, waiting for him to continue. Then the company I worked for downsized, Ben said, his hands tightening into fists on his lap. They laid off half the crew, and I was one of the unlucky ones. I thought I'd find something else, but months went by, and nothing stuck. Savings ran out fast, and before I knew it, he trailed off, gesturing vaguely. This. James felt a pang in his chest. He'd met countless people in his cab, each with their own story, but hearing Ben's struggle hit close to home. James had come dangerously close to losing everything himself once, after an accident left him unable to drive for weeks. He knew how thin the line between stability and despair could be. Any family? James asked gently. Ben shook his head. Not really. My parents passed years ago. I've got a brother, but we haven't talked in years. He doesn't even know where I am. James swallowed the lump forming in his throat. That's rough, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Ben shrugged, though the motion was more defeated than indifferent. It is what it is, he said. I've just been trying to survive, you know. James nodded again, pulling into the parking lot of the hotel. Well, he said, putting the car in park, tonight, you don't have to worry about that. Inside, James approached the front desk and explained the situation to the clerk, a skeptical-looking man in his 20s. You're paying for a room for someone else? The clerk asked, raising an eyebrow. That's right, James said firmly, handing over the cash. He didn't let himself dwell on how much it would set him back. He'd figure that part out later. Right now, Ben needed this more than he did. Returning to the cab, James handed Ben the room key. Room 12, he said. There's a shower, a bed, and fresh towels. Get some rest. Ben stared at the key in his hand, his throat working as he tried to speak. Why are you doing this? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James shrugged, his expression soft. Because I can. And because I'd hope someone would do the same for me if I ever needed it. Ben's lip quivered, and he quickly looked away, his hands tightening around the key. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, James said. Just take care of yourself. That's all I ask. As Ben stepped out of the cab and made his way to the room, James watched him go, a strange mixture of sadness and hope settling over him. He didn't know what tomorrow would hold for Ben or for himself, for that matter, but tonight, at least one person would sleep safe and warm. As James drove away, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a hushed stillness. For the first time in a while, he felt the world might be a little brighter. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of his alarm blaring, its shrill tone pulling him from a restless sleep. His small apartment was cold, the radiator rattling in its usual half-hearted attempt to provide heat. He rubbed his face, the events of the previous night drifting back into his mind. A small part of him wondered if Ben had stayed at the hotel, or if his pride had gotten the better of him. James poured himself a cup of coffee, the thin brew doing little to energize him as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills that seemed to grow taller by the day. The reality of what he'd spent on the hotel room crept into his mind, but he shook it off. I'd do it again, he muttered to himself, as if to drown out the doubts. The day ahead was busy as usual. James grabbed a quick breakfast, shoved on his jacket, and headed out to his cab. The roads were slick with fresh snow, and the city felt even grayer under the overcast sky. He tried to focus on his passengers, each with their own stories and destinations, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the man on the bench. By mid-afternoon, James found himself driving past the same budget hotel where he'd left Ben. On impulse, he pulled into the parking lot. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he wanted to check if Ben was still there, or maybe he just wanted to ease the nagging worry that had followed him all day. Stepping inside, James approached the front desk. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose, glanced up. Can I help you? Yeah, I was wondering if the guy I booked a room for last night, Ben Marshall, is still here. She frowned slightly, shuffling through some papers. He checked out about an hour ago, she said. Left a note for you, though. Surprised, James accepted the small folded piece of paper. Opening it, he saw a few shaky lines written in pen. Thank you for what you did. I don't know where I'm going, but I'll try to make it count. You reminded me that good people still exist. I hope I can be one of them again someday. James stared at the note for a long moment, his chest tightening. He'd expected nothing in return, but knowing that his small act of kindness had touched Ben deeply left him with a strange, bittersweet feeling. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, silently wishing Ben luck wherever he'd gone. Time marched on, and life for James remained an endless cycle of hard work and financial strain. His cab was starting to show its age, its once smooth ride now rattled by a suspension that needed repairs he couldn't afford. Bills piled up on his kitchen counter, their red stamps a constant reminder of how close he was to falling behind. He ate simple meals, skipped small luxuries, and drove as many hours as his body could manage. But even on the hardest days, James carried the note from Ben in his jacket pocket. Its creased and worn paper reminded him that small moments of kindness could leave a lasting impact. He wondered often if Ben had found his footing, or if he was still wandering from place to place, trying to make sense of the world. It was a year to the day since that snowy December night when James heard a sharp knock at his apartment door. He wasn't expecting anyone. His social circle was small, and visitors were rare. Wiping his hands on a dish towel, he opened the door to find a courier holding a large envelope addressed to him. The man handed it over with a polite nod before disappearing down the hallway. James closed the door, curiosity prickling at him. The envelope was thick and sturdy, with his name written in elegant gold lettering. Sliding it open, he found a handwritten letter, a check, and a framed photograph. Unfolding the letter, James read, "Dear James, you may not remember me right away, but I'll never forget you. My name is Ben Marshall, and a year ago you stopped for me when no one else would. That night on the bench, I felt invisible, like the world had given up on me. But you didn't. Because of you, I found the strength to believe in myself again. Your act of kindness set something in motion I could never have imagined. After leaving the hotel, I went to a shelter, where a counselor helped me start putting my life back together. I took on odd jobs at first and saved every penny I could. Eventually, I started a small landscaping business. To my surprise, it grew beyond anything I'd hoped for. Today, I have a team of employees, and we've been able to help others like me, people who just need someone to give them a chance. I've enclosed a check for $1,000. It's a small token of my gratitude for what you did for me that night. I know you didn't do it expecting anything in return, but I hope this helps you as much as you helped me. I also wanted to share this photograph. It's of me standing outside our office, Marshall Landscaping, surrounded by my team. Every person in this picture has a story, and every one of them found hope because someone like you reminded them they mattered. Thank you for stopping that night, James. You'll never know how much you changed my life. Forever grateful. Ben Marshall. James set the letter down, his hands trembling. He stared at the photograph, his eyes brimming with tears. Ben was standing proudly in the center, clean-shaven and smiling, the company's logo displayed on a van behind him. Around him stood a group of people, men and women of varying ages, each wearing a uniform and looking just as proud as Ben. The check lay on the table, but James hardly noticed it. The letter and photograph were the true treasures, proof that his small gesture on a cold December night had sparked a chain of kindness that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined. As he held the photograph, James felt a warmth spread through his chest. His own life was far from perfect, but in that moment, he knew he was rich in the ways that mattered most. James sat at his small kitchen table long after reading the letter, the photograph still resting in front of him. His thoughts drifted back to that cold night a year ago, when Ben had been just another struggling soul on the streets. He remembered the trembling in Ben's hands, the guarded way he spoke, and the way his eyes seemed to hold both pride and despair. At the time, James hadn't expected anything to come of it. He'd simply wanted to help another human being. But now, here was proof that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outward in ways he could never have imagined. Ben hadn't just turned his own life around, he'd created opportunities for others, becoming a beacon of hope for those who felt invisible and forgotten. James glanced at the check again. The $1,000 was a godsend. It would ease the weight of his overdue bills and even cover the repairs his cab desperately needed. But it wasn't the money that brought tears to his eyes, it was knowing he'd made a difference, however small, in someone else's life. The next day, James decided to share Ben's story with a few of his regular passengers. As they climbed into his cab, he recounted the tale not for praise, but because he felt the world could use more stories like this. One passenger, a young mother named Clara, listened intently as James spoke. "You've restored my faith in people," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's easy to forget how much good there still is in the world. Thank you for telling me." Another passenger, an elderly man named Walter, nodded thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "I've always believed that kindness is the best investment. You might not see the return right away, but it always comes back to you in one way or another." James smiled at Walter's words, feeling them settle warmly in his heart. It seemed that sharing Ben's story was inspiring others, just as the experience had inspired him. One evening, as James parked his cab to grab a quick coffee, his phone buzzed with a new email. Opening it, he was surprised to see Ben's name in the subject line. "Hi, James. I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to thank you again for stopping that night and for everything your kindness made possible. It's been a whirlwind of a year, and I still can't believe how far things have come. I wanted to let you know that we've started a new initiative at Marshall Landscaping, inspired by the lessons I learned from you. Every month, we're setting aside a portion of our profits to create a fund that supports people in need, those who've fallen on hard times and just need a bridge to get back on their feet. I'd love for you to be part of this in some way. Your insight and experience would mean the world to me, and I think together we could make an even greater impact. Let me know what you think. Forever grateful. Ben Marshall." James stared at the email, his heart swelling with pride. He reread it twice, his thoughts spinning. Ben had taken the kindness he'd received and turned it into something extraordinary. And now he was asking James to join him in expanding that kindness even further. A few weeks later, James found himself walking through the doors of Marshall Landscaping's headquarters. The air buzzed with energy, employees bustling about as they prepared for the official launch of the new initiative. Ben had insisted on flying James out to Meadowview for the event, and though James had hesitated at first, Ben's enthusiasm had been impossible to resist. "James," Ben called out, his voice ringing through the room as he approached. He looked healthier and more confident than ever, his handshake firm and his smile wide. "I'm so glad you're here." "It's good to see you," James said, taking in the sight of the bustling office. "This place is incredible, Ben. You've really built something amazing." Ben grinned, his eyes misty with gratitude. "Because of you. You gave me a second chance when I needed it most. I never would have made it here without you." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them. "I want to show you something," Ben said, leading him into a spacious conference room, where the walls were lined with photographs and testimonials. At the center of the display was a large framed letter, the very one Ben had sent James, and the photograph of Ben and his team. "This wall is for everyone who walks through these doors," Ben explained. "I want them to see what's possible when someone cares enough to stop and help." James stared at the display, his chest tight with emotion. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. Ben shook his head. "I wanted to. Because this isn't just my story, it's yours too. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. This is as much your legacy as it is mine." The words hit James like a wave, their truth undeniable. For years, he'd felt like his life was an endless grind, his efforts unnoticed and unappreciated. But now, standing in this room surrounded by the fruits of a single act of kindness, he realized that his life had been far richer than he'd ever allowed himself to believe. The event that evening was a celebration of hope and resilience. Ben introduced James to employees whose lives had been touched by the company's work, each story reaffirming the power of compassion and perseverance. By the end of the night, James felt more inspired than he had in years. For the first time in a long time, he believed that his life and the lives of others could be profoundly changed by even the simplest of acts. The next morning, James woke up in the modest hotel room Ben had arranged for him. It was simple but comfortable, with fresh linens on the bed and sunlight streaming through the curtains. He stretched and stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the events of the previous day wash over him. The launch of the initiative had been a whirlwind of emotions: gratitude, pride, and a renewed sense of purpose. It was rare for James to take time off, let alone travel, but being there had felt like exactly where he was supposed to be. After getting dressed, James headed downstairs, where Ben was waiting for him in the lobby. They greeted each other warmly before heading out to a nearby cafe. The morning air was crisp and bright, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the small space as they sat down at a corner table. "So how did it feel being the guest of honor last night?" Ben asked with a grin, sliding a cup of coffee toward James. James chuckled. "Guest of honor might be a stretch. It was your night, Ben. I was just glad to be there." Ben shook his head. "It wouldn't have happened without you, James. I hope you know that." James sipped his coffee, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone being credited for something as impactful as the initiative Ben had created. But deep down, he felt a quiet pride that he couldn't deny. As the day unfolded, Ben took James on a tour of the company's operations. They visited job sites where employees were hard at work, crafting beautiful landscapes that transformed ordinary spaces into something extraordinary. At every stop, Ben introduced James to his team, each of whom seemed eager to express their gratitude. "Ben told us about what you did for him," said a young woman named Clara, who worked in the company's administrative office. "It's inspiring to know that one small act can make such a big difference." James smiled, humbled by her words. "It wasn't much," he said. "Just the right thing to do. Sometimes that's all it takes," Clara replied. "The world could use more people like you." By the time the tour ended, James felt like he'd gained a new family. He'd always thought of himself as an ordinary man, just doing his best to get by. But seeing how his small gesture had blossomed into something so impactful filled him with a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. As they returned to the headquarters, Ben pulled James aside. "There's one more thing I wanted to share with you," he said, leading him to a quiet office. Inside, Ben handed James a folder labeled Holden's Hope Fund. The title alone made James pause. "Holden's Hope?" he asked, looking up at Ben. Ben nodded. "That's what we're calling the initiative. It felt right to name it after the man who started it all." James opened the folder, skimming through the documents inside. The fund's mission was clearly outlined: to provide resources, mentorship, and financial support to individuals facing hard times. It wasn't just about handing out money, it was about giving people the tools and encouragement they needed to rebuild their lives. This is incredible," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm just a cab driver. What do I know about running something like this?" "You know more than you think," Ben said. "You understand what it's like to struggle, to feel invisible. You've seen people at their lowest, and you've shown them compassion when they needed it most. That's what this fund is about." James swallowed hard, his mind racing. For years, he'd felt like his life was defined by its limitations, by what he couldn't do. But now, standing here with Ben, he realized that his capacity for kindness and connection was far greater than he'd ever imagined. "I don't know what to say," James admitted. Say you'll help me, Ben said, his expression earnest. You don't have to take it all on yourself. Just be part of it. We could really use someone like you. After a long pause, James nodded. Okay, he said, his voice steady. I'm in. The following months were some of the most fulfilling of James's life. Though he continued driving his cab, he spent his free time working with Ben to grow the Holden's Hope Fund. Together, they partnered with shelters, job training programs, and community organizations, creating a network of support for those who needed it most. James found himself speaking at events, sharing his story and encouraging others to take small steps of kindness in their own lives. Though public speaking wasn't his forte, he quickly realized the power of his words. Every time he told his story, he saw the impact it had on those who listened, the spark of inspiration in their eyes, the nods of understanding. Through it all, James remained humble, never losing sight of the simple act that had started it all. He often reflected on that cold December night, when a man on a bench had needed help, and he'd chosen to stop. It reminded him that the most profound changes often began with the smallest gestures. Years later, James sat in the audience at a gala hosted by the Holden's Hope Fund. The organization had grown beyond anything he or Ben could have imagined, its reach extending across the country. As he watched Ben take the stage to deliver a speech, James felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just in what they'd built, but in the lives they'd touched along the way. Ben's voice carried through the room, steady and full of gratitude. This all started with a single act of kindness, he said. Glancing toward James in the audience, someone believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. That belief gave me the strength to rebuild my life, and now it's giving others the chance to do the same. The room erupted in applause, and James felt tears prick his eyes. He'd spent so much of his life thinking of himself as ordinary, but now he knew the truth. His kindness had been extraordinary, and its impact would live on in ways he'd never dreamed. As the applause died down, Ben looked directly at James and smiled. Thank you for stopping, he said simply. And in that moment, James knew he'd found his purpose not in wealth or status, but in the quiet, transformative power of compassion.